and they thought this would be a real whizzy thing to send down to Australia, which they did. Now, before it came down here, it had to have itineraries laid out, and I hate to admit it, but I was the person that put the itineraries together. My defence is I was given totally false information. Totally false. I was told the ship had a speed of 23 knots, was a good seakeeping boat. I got a bit worried when the person that was sending the information down didn't know what the difference was between a ship's range and endurance, which I'll just explain. Range is what a ship will do if you top it up with petrol and send it merrily on its way. How far it would steam before they had to refuel. Endurance is totally different, but just as important. That's how much food and water and essential supplies it could carry. And there was often a big difference. You could have a range of 3,000 miles, but an endurance of only 5 days. That was no good. Anyway, this thing finally turned up, and they wanted some last minute adjustments to a couple of them. They wanted to try and get more ports in. Don't forget, in those days cruises were mainly 14 days. And I'd had enough by then. There'd been weeks of this arguing backwards and forwards. And I had my own ship to look after. To cut a long story short, as I've been told I waffle, it went off on its first cruise, and it was a disaster. Thing sat on its nose. It had high-speed Fiat engines. Now, when I say high-speed engines, I don't mean that they made the ship go fast. I mean, they rev very fast with small screws. So they're just like a couple of egg whists stuck out the back that can't send it anywhere. Now, today, the cruises in America, the 4-day ones, which became so popular with them, steam less miles, nautical miles, than the first port of call for Pacific Princess on a standard cruise down here, Sydney to Nuku'alofa. And that's 1,932 nautical miles pilot station to pilot station. Halfway there they decided to cut out Nuku'alofa because they weren't going to make it in time. So they went into Suva. Where else did they go? Lautoka, Vila, and then back down to Sydney. Got in about 3 hours late on the designated day, but well, it's better than not getting back at all. It was like that on every cruise. It just ran later and later and later. In the meantime, Carnival were adding more ships to their original Carnival, to their original Mardi Gras. Still it was ignored by London. They ran their ships the typical way. You had breakfast in the dining room, you had lunch in the dining room. Once a cruise they might have a deck buffet, and at night you either went dancing or went to music hall, which was put on by the ship's officers. Meanwhile, Carnival had 24 hours entertainment, showgirls, bands, you name it. They were lively. And because it was the American market over there, they lapped it up. Americans like that sort of stuff, glitzy and shiny and all the rest of it. Plus, they could eat when they wanted to. They had the dining rooms. They could go down there at certain times, but they also had pizza parlours and little cafes, and it was marvellous. And it was what people wanted. To cut a long story short again, because I've been told I waffle too much, Within 5 years, Carnival had really taken over. P&O had bought Princess Cruises, and then the Pacific Princess, after its woeful time here, was sent over to Miami and became the Love Boat. It no longer had a buff funnel, it had Princess Cruises funnel. They added the Island Venture to that, and then something else and something else. But it was too little too late. Carnival were huge. They'd bought up 5 or 6 of the major cruise lines. Norwegian Cruise Lines stayed out. They bought up about 4, and Royal Caribbean bought 3. And that was the total ships in the world. They all came under those 3, of which Carnival was the biggest. And P&O's acquisition of Pacific Princess didn't last long, because Princess Cruises was taken over by Carnival. It's still their largest premier cruise line today. So that left P&O with virtually nothing. They had no ships. They had Oriana and Canberra. Canberra's 40,000 tonnes. Were about the last 2, not built for cruising, although the Oriana adapted well. Canberra never did. The cruising in Australia went downhill, mainly because it was the wrong ships, until the Sea Princess turned up, which was bought for the market down here by P&O. It's the ex-Kungsholm, but they modernised it, took a stack off and all the rest of it. But they sent it down here. Such a hastily dry dock, and what's the word I would use? Update would be. On its first cruise, people in stadium deck had a shower and the water poured out on deck 3 or deck 4. The paint was falling off in the water because there was only one coat, and the engines kept stopping because nobody had told the P&O engineers that the Götaverken engines had one big difference. Usually the oil flow through the filters, 2 arrows following each other, so you could line them up for the flow. Götaverken were different. You had to revolve them until the points of the arrows touched, and then they were quite happy. They found out after 3 months of stopping and cleaning out oil filters and all the rest of it. It was disaster time all around. Once she got going, she was okay. I was very glad to see the back of Pacific Princess, and it did well as the Love Boat, although the Americans got a bit funny about British officers being the real people running a ship they all thought was American. They were all looking for Captain Stubing and Isaac the barman and God knows what else. It was stupid. So anyway, running a sort of alongside of that was the big movement, shall we say, towards shorter cruising. 4-day. Americans loved it. Australians, no good, because you can't get to your first port and back in 4 days. So, special fly cruise things were put in charter by Princess, which was now almost Carnival. Fly people over to the States for a cruise. That left the ones down here wallowing out to sea with virtually nothing. And that's how it all started. The downfall of P&O was brought on by a very ignorant board of directors, none of which had the slightest knowledge of what ships were. None at all. The Americans, when they took it over, brought in, which I thought at the start would be a big mistake, ex-military, skippers and admirals and God knows what else, but it worked. So that was the end of P&O. By the time the Pacific Princess got back to America, they painted out the buff funnel and it had the Princess Cruises logo on it. Just the sea witch with the eye. The eye got taken out in a few years' time. They say they blinded it. And that was the end of that. We all think of Cunard as the ultimate British cruise line. It's Carnival. Really is. But that guy, I forget his name, who ran the whole thing, very clever man, wanted a transatlantic ship and to bring back transatlantic crossings. So he built the Queen Mary 2. Queen Elizabeth II before that, but she took off to do other things. She was a strange mixture ship. Not very popular, especially down in the Falklands, where she got the nickname of the Black Pig. I'll go into that another time. There's one funny story about the Pacific Princess which still has me laughing today. I was on board the Arcadia at Pyrmont in Sydney with the captain and chief officer. And I'll just use D as his initial because he's still alive. Captain D. We had a few drinks and all the rest of it. And he said, let's go and have a look at the Pacific Princess. So round we trotted to Circular Quay, went on board. And Captain C received us well. And then regaled us with how much better his ship was than the old dinosaurs like the Arcadia. Captain D, I could see his pipe getting more and more clenched. We left as soon as we could. A few weeks later, I'd flown to New Zealand to join Arcadia for a voyage conference. And we were in Auckland, and further up, the Pacific Princess was in the Bay of Islands. And we were both going to leave at the same time, and we were going to steam into Sydney together, the old and the new. Sounds good, very impressive, nice marketing. But what happened was, we'd only just cleared the northern tip of New Zealand, and it was a rotten night. I'm not talking major gale, but it was choppy. And big wind. And Paul, who was the second officer and navigator, called me up to the bridge. He said, do you want to see something funny? So there ahead of us was the Pacific Princess, bouncing on its nose into the chop, doing 8 knots. That's all it could manage, 8 knots. Next thing I knew, a pair of blue and white flannelette pyjama pants appeared beside me, and when I looked up there was the captain's jacket and Captain D with his cap on and his pipe stuck out the side, and he was watching this ship. And as we got near, he said, get me the bridge, Pacific Princess. So there was a kerfuffle around, and then he's holding the phone. I heard him say, good evening, John. How are you? Can't see any flares of distress or flags flown upside down or any other visible sign. Tell me, do you want us to give you a tow? And he hastily pulled the phone away. It may have been put down from the other end in a great great slam. And we actually steamed past Pacific Princess, going a bit closer than normal regulations allow. And our ship's rails were lined with passengers all waving merrily, and we were all out on the wing bridge waving merrily. And Pacific Princess, there was nobody on the on the wing bridge. There was nobody on the decks, and even with binoculars you couldn't see anybody in that wheelhouse. Anyway, we got into Sydney on time. For me it was just a ferry journey. I had nothing to do with running it. And no sign of Pacific Princess. She actually got in at 3:30 a.m. next morning. And she's the only P&O ship ever not to arrive, not only on time, but on the day gazetted for her arrival. So much for the skiting. It always comes back to you eventually. So, and even dunderheads like me who usually have no idea what's going on around them, it hit so deeply that we still have a chuckle about it now. And just before Paul left, he came to Australia, and as a matter of fact, he came up to the hospital to see me. And as soon as we said Auckland Bay of Islands, next 10 minutes, just couldn't stop the laughter. Life's like that, isn't it? 1 minute one thing, next minute the other. Anyway, I've been told I can't say be nice to people. I'm told it sounds sickening, so I'll just say look after yourself. Cheers.